people. Nehemiah chapter number 4, you have this and we'll briefly look at this. And as I mentioned this morning, what I want us to do is just step back and do a review here to understand why Nehemiah, why are we here? If we don't see the why, we're not going to see the significance of passing a brick and rebuilding a wall. And the book of Nehemiah is that about rebuilding. So let's stand here for a moment and let's look at one verse. And I believe it's a significant verse in this book, at least the first half of the book. Nehemiah chapter 4, and notice in verse number 6. Nehemiah 4, verse 6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. And now what he's saying there is, we've gotten half of it done. And that's quite a task. That one, that they got permission, that they got it going, they got building, but they're halfway there. And how important is it not only to start right, but to make sure we finish right? But he gives the reason, and he says this, read it with me, the last part of the verse, for the people had a mind to work. And that's, again, I think what we saw last week. Those who are busy working, and then there are those who are not necessarily involved in working, who are laboring and praying. And it's been a full mind of one body to be fully consecrated, to have a mind to work. And here's the thing, after neighborhood Bible time, it doesn't end. We're still to be on mission. And remember, Jesus would work with the multitude, send them away and send the disciples into a boat and send them to the other side, and a storm's going to come upon them. And Jesus constantly was about reaching the lost, equipping His disciples, and there was never a time that it wasn't important to stay on mission. But here Nehemiah says the people had a mind to work. But I want us to step back and let's regroup this book and see there's a lot more in store in this book. But let's just step back a little bit and look at a review of the setting of Nehemiah. Thank you. Please be seated. I'll give you the title here towards the end. But one of the things we've talked about in the book of Nehemiah is that it is a book about rebuilding. Who among us doesn't need a fresh start at different times? And maybe you're one who needs a fresh start tonight. We sang, "Great is thy faithfulness," and then "Day by day." But "Great is thy faithfulness" is one of those songs that reminds me that we can have a fresh start every day. His mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Many of us face relationships that need mending or businesses that require rebuilding. As a believer, as a child of God, you're always going to find yourself in constant renewal cycles. In other words, revival is not a week here or there on a church calendar. Revival is any time we're in need of drawing back near to the Lord, and that's always. Some seek to restore their integrity after they've made a mistake. There may be those who have lost loved ones, and you're working to rebuild in that opportunity to give the gospel. In various ways, many of us will spend time working on some form of rebuilding in our life or in our ministry this coming year. The encouraging news is that it's never too late to start anew. It's not too late to start. And Nehemiah is one who gives us that. Nehemiah lived 25 centuries ago, and he gives the essence in his example of rebuilding. His story is preserved in the Bible, offering us timeless wisdom. Nehemiah was not a preacher or a prophet. He was a civil servant. He's an ordinary person. And you can read the book of Nehemiah with that in mind and see how you can relate to Nehemiah. He was an ordinary person. He just applied universal Bible principles to restore a broken city and to rejuvenate many broken spirits among the people of God. And he leaves behind for us a blueprint for success that can be a source of hope and strength for any of us who want to follow his example. And so I believe one of the reasons God brought us to the book of Nehemiah as a church family, as a body moving into this, is because we all need to embark upon new beginnings and need to recognize that we can do so. One of the things about Nehemiah is that it is a manual for leaders. Everyone who aspires to leadership, and the essence of leadership is simply influence. The most remarkable treatise on leadership was written around 425 BC, and it's still largely unknown today, but it should be known by every child of God. Again, it's written by a man of prominence, not a man of prominence in business or in politics, but he lived there in the ancient Middle East. He not only had a great philosophy of leadership, but he truly lived it out. Nehemiah went from being completely unknown to achieving national recognition throughout his lifetime. And this classic book of Nehemiah has been chosen by God, and it's included as a part of God's Word, and Jesus tells us that it is forever settled in heaven. And Nehemiah had something to say 2,500 years ago, and he still has something to say for us even tonight. We can learn from Nehemiah. What can you learn from Nehemiah? Well, you can learn how to relate to a touchy boss. You can learn the balance between faith in God and personal planning. You can learn how to handle executive decisions, and you can learn how to deal with discouragement. You can learn what to do with unwarranted criticism. And these truths are all modeled by Nehemiah as he accomplishes an incredible project against unbelievable odds. One of Nehemiah's traits, as I mentioned earlier, is that he's extremely relatable. He was not a prophet, a priest, or a scribe. He was just an ordinary man. He was a man who saw the need and he took the lead. And there were many men like that. David was one as a teenage boy going out doing his errand on the behalf of his father, going to check on the brothers at the battlefield, and he simply sees a need and he takes the lead, and he's criticized. He's accused of having ulterior motives. He's accused of being proud and haughty and arrogant. And David's response was, is there not a cause? Why isn't someone else seeing the need and taking the lead? Nehemiah was a man of God, but he was also a true servant leader. Not only did he rally God's people to build for God's glory, but Nehemiah himself jumps in and he picks up bricks himself. Now, as I mentioned, I want us to see the setting because I think this, to me, it helped, at least for me, unlock some things as I was reminded of where this is, because it's easy in some ways to say, well, that's back then, that's in the olden days, and that's back in the black and white days, you know, the black and white TV, and it's just things were different. My kids will watch something. They're watching Andy Griffith, and they were talking about staying in a hotel for 35 cents. 35 cents a night. And Priscilla said, that's pretty cheap, isn't it? I said, it's very cheap. And I said, but things were different then. And sometimes we can just mark something off as being easier and not as relevant. But I think once we, again, understand the setting, it helps us to understand the significance of what Nehemiah did and why. He wasn't simply building a wall because they wanted to better the garden. They weren't trying to just improve the looks of the house in which they were living. No, there was a spiritual significance. Go back in your mind to when Jewish history begins. Jewish history began in the year 2000 with Abraham. But it wasn't until around 1,000 years later that Israel gained significance as a nation under the leadership of Saul, David, and Solomon. During the reigns of these three kings, Israel's prominence grew, and it was acknowledged as a very significant military power, especially during King David's 40-year reign. Israel flourished significantly. But after his death, the throne passed to his son, Solomon. Now, Solomon, you remember, prayed for wisdom, and God gave him wisdom. However, when you fail to trust and obey and apply that wisdom, you and I can wind up like Solomon, who in the last part of his life, he compromised so much with the world that God ended up judging him. We're told in 1 Kings 11 and verse 11 that the Lord said to Solomon, "Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, For as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant." It doesn't really matter how good a person might be. We sometimes say, well, they're good people. Well, Solomon was a good person until he wasn't. David was a good man until he wasn't. And if we're going to just cover, well, these are blood relatives, they're good people, it's okay that they don't do it right. Or these are just, he was just a good preacher, but he didn't do everything right. And we're not understanding having God's favor and not having God's favor is not a trivial issue. When Solomon died, there was a split in the nation's military ranks. This is not a small thing. Well, Solomon, he just didn't do the wisest thing. No, he didn't do what God told him to do. And so there became a major split. Israel became a divided kingdom. 10 tribes migrated north and settled in Samaria, while the other 2 went south and settled in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. This is the darkest time in the nation's history. During this division, a civil war occurs. And just as the blight of the Civil War upon our country, greater was the blight of this civil war among God's people. 10 northern tribes were called Israel. The 2 southern groups were named Judah. Again, one of the lowest points in the nation's history, and one of the greatest tragedies occurred, not from an attack without, but from within. They were attacked from within. The walls of their spiritual heritage began to crumble. That's why we say so often, you make your decision makes you. During this time of division, literally all hell broke loose, as Satan was an agent to divide and to destroy. Chaotic conditions prevailed. And so God judged Israel. When the Assyrians invaded in 722 BC, God was judging Israel. And what happened? Those 10 tribes were finished. The northern kingdom ceased to exist because God allowed the Syrians to invade and take over. And there were some from the north that fled to the south to escape Assyrian control. And the land of Judah remained a Jewish nation for more than 300 years. However, in 586 BC, Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem and all Judah, and he took the people captive. And so this began what is called the Babylonian captivity. And you remember the biblical account we find in 2 Chronicles 36. If you want to note that, verse 18 and 19, it records the end of Judah's history and the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 18, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king, and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. Verse 19. Listen. And they burnt the house of God, and break down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. Was it a big deal that Solomon didn't apply wisdom to his life in the latter days? After the Babylonian takeover, Jerusalem was totally leveled. The magnificent place where God's glory was once displayed is now destroyed. The wall lay in ruins, and the wild dogs fed upon any edible remains, and the armies of Babylon marched back home with all the treasures of Judah. It was during this dismal time that Psalm 137 was written, where the psalmist cried aloud, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign and a strange land?" Babylon had come and taken away the Israeli captives, and their song had ended. 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 20 adds a final word. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Now that's important. Those Jews who lived through this siege of Jerusalem were bound together. They were chained together like slaves. They were sent to Babylon, a trek of more than 800 miles. Under Nebuchadnezzar and his wicked son, the Jews lived as they had centuries before in Egypt as slaves to a foreign power. It's bad. This wasn't why nor how they were supposed to live. This wasn't why God released them from Egypt. This wasn't why God had sent a deliverer. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. As I said this morning, everything's all right with the Father's design. But when we don't follow the Father's design, everything's not always all right in the Father's house. But with all that said, I want you to remember this. God didn't forget about them. Amen. He had a purpose. He had a plan. In verse number 20 of 2 Chronicles 36, he concludes, until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. So here's what happened. The Medes and the Persians invaded Babylon. So Babylon overthrows. The Medes and the Persians invade Babylon and overthrow it, forcing the Babylonian Empire to surrender. And so what happened then? Well, 2 Chronicles 36 verse 22 tells us, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished. Listen, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. Question, was Cyrus a believer? No. On the surface, it may have sounded like one, but he was not. He was, however, concerned for the welfare of the Jews. And God is not limited to working only with his people. God can use anybody. God used the donkey. God can use anybody. And he works in the lives and minds of unbelievers when he chooses. He used unbelievers to be the tool, the agent to bring discipline and chastisement to his people. And he's also using an unbeliever to help get his people back on the place of recovery. You see, God's ultimate plan was to get the Jews back into their land. So Cyrus, an unbeliever, he sends a proclamation in writing throughout his kingdom which said, and this is 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 23, Cyrus the king of Persia says, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem which is in Judah, Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. You see what he's saying? He said, let God's people go back to that city that was destroyed 70 something years before. And so this period of history has been called by some as the second Exodus. And so the Jews returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of 3 men. So, Company A. The first one was a man by the name of Zerubbabel. He was the commanding officer. And the Bible tells us that he took the first group, a large group in, concerned about the building up of the temple, instituting temple worship. About 80 years later, God lays it upon a second man's heart by the name of Ezra. That's Company B. And Ezra is now the commander-in-chief. He takes a smaller group of Jews in. He's not so concerned about the building of the temple walls as he is about the wills of the builders, making sure that there is a reviving taking place. Then 13 years after that, so Zerubbabel, 80 years later Ezra, 13 years after that, Nehemiah. He leads Company C back to the destroyed city. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier to take special note of the term house of God and the wall. When you look at the book of Ezra, there's a term that sticks out. Ezra was about the house of God. But Nehemiah is about the wall. The wall of Jerusalem is at the heart of the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah is one of the oldest books in the Old Testament. In fact, you have Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah right together. You have Ezekiel close to it, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi right there. So you've got books earlier in your Old Testament. You've got your later books in your Old Testament, but they're about that same time period. So Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zechariah, and Malachi, we're looking at about the same period of time. The book of Ezra, which comes just before Nehemiah, records how the house of God was rebuilt in the city of Jerusalem. What was the purpose of rebuilding the house of God in Jerusalem? What was that for? Worship, relationship. When Pharaoh let the people of God go from Egypt, one of the things that he didn't want them to do was to go too far, didn't want them to take their cattle. What he was doing was trying to disrupt their worship. The reason that they were wanting to go from Egypt partly was so that they could worship. Ezra was concerned about the rebuilding of the house of God because of the importance of worship. But the temple, while it was rebuilt, it was also without protection for 90 years until God led Nehemiah to provide the leadership necessary to build a wall. And his account of this project is what we call the book of Nehemiah. Is church important to our relationship with God? Sure. But how valuable is it going to be to you or anybody if it is not protected? Remember Brother Comfort when he was here last year and preached a message on Sunday night. Wasn't sure if he was going to be able to preach. And it was one of his first times back to preaching. And he said after Sunday morning, I think I can do it. And he preached Sunday night on protecting the cause of Christ. What value is it to have church if you're not going to protect the cause of Jesus Christ? Nehemiah, long before the church was established, understood why Ezra went back into the homeland to rebuild the temple and institute temple worship, all of which was part of the establishing of the relationship of God. But without protection, it was not going to be as effective. Nehemiah, still a Jew in exile, with a secure civil service position, he felt a deep connection, however, to the cause of God. So he leaves Babylon, he returns to Jerusalem. He's driven by a clear goal. One, he wants to rally the people of God. He wants to restore their hope in God's cause, and he wants to rebuild the holy city by rebuilding the wall. Nehemiah had a detailed plan. He saw the end goal from the start. He fostered teamwork, and he completed the task with determination. And his approach is outlined throughout the book of Nehemiah, and we've just scratched the surface as we've moved into chapter number 4. Now here's the title that I gave to this, which I think I used earlier on when we started this. And here's the title: It's Never Too Late for a New Beginning. Nehemiah could have said, this is so far in the rearview mirror. This isn't possible. Let's just make most of what we have, and if it goes, it goes. But Nehemiah says it's not too late for a new beginning. It's a new day. And if God's cause means anything, it means something, and somebody ought to do something. And just as David did of old, is there not a cause? Nehemiah said, it's never too late for a new beginning. It makes no difference how long the relationship has been left in a breach. You can establish a rebuilding of that relationship. It matters not how long you've been sitting on the bench looking at the will of God from the outside. You can begin to rebuild and get into the will of God. It doesn't matter how long you've been blaming others and not taking the attitude of a Joseph. God meant it for good. No matter what somebody else may have done, God is greater, and start the rebuilding process. It doesn't matter how long you've been deflecting responsibility. You can start today rebuilding that relationship with God. It doesn't matter how long you've been out of sorts with God. It's not too late for a new beginning. It doesn't matter that it's been too long since you've passed out a gospel tract. And take the first step. How are you going to take the journey of a lifetime? With one step of faith. How did you get saved? A step of faith, a decision of faith. And you can take another step of faith, a single step of faith. It's never too late for a new beginning. Let's stand together, please.